At 10:20 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge of the Akagi, minutes away from launching the largest carrier strike in naval history. By 10:27, his flagship was a floating crematorium, and the entire Pacific War had reversed itself. 7 minutes. That's all it took. The phrase 5 minutes at Midway gets thrown around a lot in naval history circles, and for good reason. It's become shorthand for the most dramatic reversal of fortune in modern warfare. 3 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, all fatally struck within roughly 5 minutes of each other. A 4th, Hiryu, would follow before dawn the next day. These weren't just any carriers. These were the same ships that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the sharp edge of an empire that had spent the previous 6 months conquering everything from Wake Island to Burma, and they were all about to burn. Here's what makes this story more than just a tactical victory. At 10:20 that morning, every advantage belonged to Japan. They had 4 fleet carriers against America's 3. They had the most experienced naval aviators in the world. They had spent the entire morning swatting away American attacks like flies. Torpedo bombers, level bombers, fighters, all shot down or driven off without a single hit on a Japanese ship. The American carrier Yorktown had been so badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just a month earlier that Japanese intelligence had written her off as sunk. She wasn't. She was out there, somewhere in the Pacific, and her dive bombers were about to change everything. The Japanese didn't know it yet, but they were 7 minutes away from losing the Pacific War. The disaster actually began hours before the dive bombers arrived, and it began with a decision that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. At 4:30 that morning, while it was still dark, Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway Island itself. 108 aircraft from all 4 carriers, tasked with neutralizing the American airbase. The plan was straightforward. Knock out Midway's defenses, then deal with any American fleet that showed up. The problem was that the plan assumed Nagumo would know where the American fleet was before he had to commit his reserve aircraft. And at 4:30 in the morning, Nagumo didn't know where the American fleet was. His scout planes hadn't found anything yet. So he kept a second wave of aircraft armed with torpedoes, held in reserve on his carriers, ready to strike American ships if they appeared. This was standard doctrine. This was the smart play. Then the reports started coming in from Midway. The first wave hit the island around 6:20 in the morning. The attack did damage. Hangars destroyed, fuel tanks burning, but the strike leader radioed back that the American defenses were still operational. A second strike on the island would be necessary. Nagumo now faced a choice. His reserve aircraft were armed with torpedoes, which were useless against land targets. If he wanted to hit Midway again, he'd need to swap those torpedoes for general-purpose bombs. That meant bringing the torpedoes up from the magazines, removing them from the aircraft, then bringing up bombs and attaching those instead. It was a lot of work, it would take time, and it would leave his decks cluttered with ordnance and fuel lines while his crews scrambled to make the switch. At 7:15, Nagumo gave the order, start the rearming process. 13 minutes later, everything changed. At 7:28, one of Nagumo's scout planes, launched from the cruiser Tone and delayed by mechanical problems, finally sent a report. 10 enemy surface ships sighted. No mention of carriers, just surface ships. Nagumo had a problem. If those ships included carriers, he'd need his aircraft armed with torpedoes to sink them. If they were just cruisers and destroyers, bombs would work fine, and he'd already ordered his crews to switch from torpedoes to bombs. He sent a message back to the scout plane. Ascertain ship types. The minutes crawled by. Nagumo's crew kept working, pulling torpedoes off aircraft, staging bombs nearby. The hangar decks were getting crowded. Finally, at 8:09, the scout reported back, the enemy appears to have a carrier in company. Now Nagumo was trapped. Half his reserve aircraft were still carrying torpedoes. The other half had been partially converted to bombs. His flight decks were cluttered with ordnance in various stages of loading. And somewhere out there, an American carrier was preparing to strike him. He gave the order to halt the bomb conversion and switch back to torpedoes again. This is what historians call the rearming whiplash. First torpedoes, then bombs, then back to torpedoes. Each switch meant more time, more clutter, more confusion, and the whole time American aircraft were getting closer. The first American attacks arrived around 7:05 and they were a disaster. 6 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers from Midway came in first. They were the newest torpedo bombers in the American arsenal, and 5 of them were shot down without scoring a single hit. 4 B-26 Marauders came next, also carrying torpedoes. 2 of them were destroyed. The survivors limped back to Midway with their aircraft shot to pieces. More attacks followed throughout the morning. B-17 Flying Fortresses dropped bombs from high altitude. Marine dive bombers made their runs. None of them hit anything. From the Japanese perspective, the morning was going beautifully. Yes, the American attacks were annoying, and yes, they were forcing the combat air patrol to stay busy. Every time American aircraft appeared, the Zero fighters had to dive down to intercept them, burn fuel, expend ammunition, then climb back up to altitude. The attacks weren't hurting the carriers. They were just distracting. Then the carrier torpedo squadrons arrived. Around 9:20, 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from the Hornets Torpedo Squadron 8 appeared on the horizon, flying low and slow, heading straight for the Japanese fleet. The Devastator was already obsolete in 1942. It had a top speed of 206 miles per hour. The Zero fighters hunting them were nearly 130 miles per hour faster. Its torpedo required a long, straight approach at low altitude, making the aircraft a sitting duck for anti-aircraft fire. And Torpedo 8 was attacking without fighter escort. Their Wildcat fighters had gotten separated during the flight out. The Zeros fell on them like wolves. Within minutes, all 15 Devastators were falling into the sea. Not a single torpedo hit a Japanese ship. Of the 30 aircrew aboard those 15 aircraft, only one man survived, Ensign George Gay, who floated in the water for hours, hiding under a seat cushion, watching the rest of the battle unfold around him. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise attacked next. 14 Devastators, again without fighter cover. 10 were shot down. No hits. Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown came in after that, with a handful of Wildcat fighters as escort. The Zeros swarmed them anyway. 10 of the 12 Devastators were destroyed, still no hits. In total, the 3 American torpedo squadrons lost 35 out of 41 aircraft. They scored exactly 0 torpedo hits on Japanese ships. It was, by any tactical measure, a catastrophic failure. It was also the reason the dive bombers succeeded. Here's what the Japanese defenders didn't realize. Every time they dove to intercept a torpedo attack, they were leaving the upper altitudes unguarded. The Zero fighters had been in almost continuous combat since 7:05 that morning. They'd been chasing off attack after attack, diving from altitude, burning fuel, climbing back up. The torpedo squadrons, flying low and slow and dying by the dozen, had pulled the entire combat air patrol down to sea level. At 10:20, there were almost no Zeros above 5,000 feet. And at 10:20, 54 American dive bombers were cruising at 15,000 feet, looking for targets. The dive bombers almost didn't find them. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, leading the Enterprise's air group, had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour. His calculations said they should be here, but there was nothing below except empty ocean. He was running low on fuel. Some of his pilots were already peeling off to head back to the carrier before their tanks ran dry. McCluskey made a decision that would change the war. Instead of turning back, he continued northwest, gambling that the Japanese had changed course. Minutes later, one of his pilots spotted a lone Japanese destroyer below, racing northeast at high speed. The destroyer Arashi had been hunting an American submarine and was now sprinting to rejoin the fleet. McCluskey followed her wake like an arrow pointing toward the target. At 10:20, the Japanese carriers came into view. Imagine the scene from the bridge of the Akagi. Admiral Nagumo and his staff are exhausted but confident. They've survived 6 hours of American attacks without a scratch. The flight deck below is packed with aircraft. Zeros warming their engines, torpedo bombers armed and fueled, crews making final preparations for the massive strike that will destroy the American carriers. Nagumo has done the math. His first wave, the aircraft that hit Midway, has already recovered. His second wave is nearly ready to launch. In perhaps 10 minutes, he'll have over 100 aircraft in the air, heading toward the American fleet. The battle is almost won, then a lookout screams. Helldivers, McCluskey's dive bombers from the Enterprise, had arrived first, catching the Japanese with their defenses down. At almost the same moment, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's Bombing 3 from the Yorktown appeared from a different direction. Neither group knew the other was there. Pure coincidence had brought them to the same place at the same time. The result was chaos. McCluskey had intended for his squadrons to split their attacks between multiple carriers. In the confusion of the moment, that didn't happen. Almost all of the Enterprise aircraft dove on the same target. The Kaga, the largest carrier in the Japanese fleet. Only 3 pilots from Bombing 6 broke off to attack the Akagi. Lieutenant Richard Best, the squadron commander, saw what was happening and made an instant decision. He pulled out of his dive on the Kaga and switched targets, taking his 2 wingmen with him. 3 aircraft. That's all that attacked the flagship of the Japanese carrier fleet. Let's take this carrier by carrier. Kaga came under attack first, with at least 25 dive bombers screaming down on her. The first 3 bombs were near misses, sending up huge columns of water but causing no direct damage. Then the hits started landing. 4 bombs struck the Kaga's flight deck in rapid succession. One hit just forward of the island, detonating a small gasoline truck that was parked on deck. The explosion sprayed burning fuel across the bridge, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and most of his senior officers instantly. Other bombs collapsed sections of the flight deck, destroyed elevators, and ignited the aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip on the deck. Within seconds, the entire ship was engulfed in flames. The Kaga had taken multiple hits, but the worst damage was the loss of command. With the captain and bridge crew dead, coordination collapsed. Damage control parties worked without central direction. Fires spread unchecked. She would burn for hours before finally sinking at 7:25 that evening. Roughly 800 men died, about 1/3 of her crew. Akagi took fewer hits, but the result was just as catastrophic. Only 3 dive bombers attacked her. Best and his 2 wingmen, Lieutenant Junior Grade Edwin Kroger and Ensign Frederick Weber. Best's bomb was the one that mattered. His 1,000-pound bomb struck near the after rim of the amidship's elevator, punched through the flight deck, and detonated in the upper hangar. That hangar was packed with 18 Nakajima torpedo bombers, fully fueled and armed. The explosion turned the hangar into an inferno in less than a second. Aviation fuel ignited. Torpedoes began cooking off. Secondary explosions rippled through the ship as ammunition detonated and fuel lines ruptured. The fireproof hangar doors, designed to contain exactly this kind of disaster, had been left open to facilitate the rapid launch that was supposed to happen in minutes. Kroger's bomb was a near miss that damaged the Akagi's rudder. Weber's bomb either hit or narrowly missed the port side of the flight deck. In the confusion, nobody could say for certain. What survivors remembered was the sound. First the scream of the dive, then a single massive blast, then a second, larger explosion as the hangar erupted, then silence as the anti-aircraft guns stopped firing because their crews were dead or dying. Admiral Nagumo was still on the bridge when the fires reached the island structure. The elevator that Best's bomb had destroyed was now a gaping wound in the ship, belching smoke and flame. Aircraft on the flight deck stood at impossible angles, burning, their fuel tanks rupturing and adding to the inferno. The hammock splinter shields on the bridge, designed to protect against shrapnel, caught fire. Smoke poured into the ready rooms below. Communications failed as electrical cables burned through. Around 10:46, Nagumo and his staff had no choice. They couldn't command from a burning ship. Using ropes lowered from the bridge windows, they climbed down to the deck and transferred to the light cruiser Nagara. Captain Taijiro Aoki remained behind to fight the ship. He fought for hours. It was hopeless. With the generators destroyed, there was no power for pumps. Fire mains were ruptured. Chemical extinguishers were either destroyed or empty. Crewmen attacked the flames with hand pumps and buckets, and every time they seemed to make progress, another explosion would drive them back. In the early hours of June 5th, Aoki finally requested permission to scuttle. Destroyers Arashi, Nawaki, and others fired Type 93 torpedoes into the dying carrier. The Akagi sank at approximately 4:55 in the morning. Roughly 263 men died. Most of the crew survived because they had hours to evacuate before the scuttling. The ship herself was beyond saving. Soryu was hit at almost exactly the same moment as the other 2 carriers, attacked by the Yorktown's Bombing 3. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie led 13 dive bombers down on the Soryu. The attack was nearly simultaneous with the Enterprise strikes on Kaga and Akagi, a coincidence of timing that meant the Japanese combat air patrol couldn't protect any of their carriers. 3 bombs struck the Soryu's flight deck. The first hit near the forward elevator, blowing it open and igniting fires below. The second and third struck around the amidships elevator, collapsing the deck structure and spreading flames into the gasoline storage and munitions areas. Soryu may have been the fastest to die. Within 10 minutes of the first hit, her engine stopped. Steering failed. The fire mains were destroyed, making organized firefighting impossible. By 10:40, she was nothing but smoke and flames. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto ordered abandoned ship roughly 20 minutes after the first bomb hit. Unlike the chaos on Kaga, where the captain died immediately, Yanagimoto had time to make the call, and time to decide he wouldn't leave himself. Survivors remembered what happened next. A chief petty officer, reportedly a champion wrestler, tried to physically carry the captain off the bridge. Yanagimoto refused. He stood there, sword in hand, reportedly singing the Japanese national anthem as his ship burned around him. The wrestler had to be dragged away by other crewmen. He couldn't save his captain. Nobody could. Soryu sank at approximately 7:13 that evening. 718 men died, including Yanagimoto. 3 carriers were now burning wrecks, but the battle wasn't over. Hiryu had escaped. When the dive bombers attacked, the Hiryu was several miles away from her sister ships, separated by the fleet's defensive maneuvering. The American pilots either didn't see her or couldn't reach her before they had to pull out of their dives. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding the Hiryu, immediately ordered a counterattack. At around 11 o'clock, 18 dive bombers launched from his flight deck, heading toward the American carriers. They found the Yorktown. The Yorktown's combat air patrol intercepted the Japanese strike, shooting down several aircraft before they could attack. It wasn't enough. 3 bombs struck the American carrier, knocking out her boilers and starting fires. Damage control parties got the fires under control. Engineers restored power. Within 2 hours, the Yorktown was making 19 knots again, preparing to recover her aircraft. Then Yamaguchi's second strike arrived. This time it was torpedo bombers. The Yorktown's gunners and fighters shot down most of them, but 2 torpedoes found their mark. The carrier took catastrophic flooding, developed a severe list, and was eventually abandoned. The Yorktown would later be finished off by a Japanese submarine while under tow. She was the only American carrier lost at Midway, and she took 2 separate Japanese strikes to kill. Yamaguchi had drawn blood. Now the Americans were coming for him. Around 5 o'clock that afternoon, dive bombers from the Enterprise and the surviving Yorktown aircraft located the Hiryu. Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher led the attack, the same pilot who had helped destroy the Kaga that morning. His mixed group of Enterprise and Yorktown SBDs dove on the last Japanese carrier. At least 4 bombs struck the Hiryu near her elevators and amidships. One of them, probably a 1,000-pound bomb, blew the forward elevator up against the bridge structure, crushing the navigation equipment and trapping men inside the island. Fires spread with the same inevitability that had claimed her sister ships. Yamaguchi stayed aboard as long as he could, overseeing damage control efforts that were ultimately futile. After nightfall, with the fires clearly uncontrollable, destroyers torpedoed the Hiryu to send her down. She sank in the early hours of June 5th. Admiral Yamaguchi went down with his ship. So did Captain Tomeo Kaku. So did many of their aircrew, trapped below decks by the fires. 4 carriers. All 4 of them had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. All 4 of them were now on the bottom of the Pacific. The dive bombers had done it in 2 strikes. 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon. The 5 minutes everyone talks about were really just the beginning. The fires burned for hours. The scuttlings continued into the next morning. The death toll climbed past 3,000 Japanese sailors and aviators. The United States lost the Yorktown, a destroyer, and approximately 300 men. In pure exchange terms, it was one of the most lopsided naval victories in history. The 5 minutes weren't an accident. They were the result of a dozen different factors coming together at exactly the wrong moment. Start with the rearming chaos. When the dive bombers arrived, every Japanese carrier had aircraft in various states of readiness. Some were armed with torpedoes, some had been partially converted to bombs, some were being converted back to torpedoes. Munitions were everywhere, in the hangars, on the flight decks, staged near aircraft while crews worked to attach them. The ordnance handling procedures that might have prevented catastrophe were being ignored. Ammunition hoists were running constantly. Magazine doors were open. Fuel lines were charged and ready. Everything was optimized for a rapid launch against the American carriers. Everything was also optimized for a catastrophic chain reaction if a bomb penetrated the flight deck. Then there was doctrine. Japanese carrier design emphasized offensive striking power over defensive resilience. Their flight decks were thinner than American designs. Their hangar arrangements had less compartmentalization. Their damage control training and equipment were generally inferior to American standards. American carriers would suffer grievous damage throughout the Pacific War. The Yorktown took 2 separate strikes at Midway and still had to be finished off by a submarine. Later carriers like the Franklin and Bunker Hill would survive damage that would have destroyed any Japanese flat top. The Japanese carriers were built to hit hard and hit first. They weren't built to survive getting hit back. The combat air patrol was another critical failure. The Zero pilots had been magnificent that morning. They'd shot down torpedo bomber after torpedo bomber, protecting their carriers against wave after wave of American attacks. The problem was that they'd been doing it at sea level. Torpedo bombers fly low, Zeros intercept low. Every time an American torpedo squadron attacked, the Japanese fighters dove to meet them, then had to climb back to altitude, refuel, rearm, and do it again. By 10:20, the cap was exhausted and disorganized. Many Zeros were on the carrier's decks, refueling. Others were still at low altitude, recovering from the last torpedo interception. The dive bombers came in at 15,000 feet. There was almost nothing up there to stop them, and there was luck. McCluskey's decision to continue searching instead of turning back. The Arashi pointing the way like a compass needle. The coincidental arrival of the Enterprise and Yorktown air groups at almost the exact same moment. The fact that the Japanese carriers were just minutes away from launching their own devastating strike. If the timing had been different by 10 minutes in either direction, the battle might have gone very differently. The Japanese would never recover from Midway. The 4 carriers lost represented the core of their fleet aviation capability. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had been the most experienced carrier air groups in the world. Their pilots had trained together for years. They had struck Pearl Harbor, raided Ceylon, dominated the Indian Ocean. Now they were gone. Japan would build more carriers and train more pilots, but they would never replicate what they lost on June 4th. 1942. The veteran aviators who died at Midway, the deck crews, the squadron leaders, the maintenance personnel who kept the aircraft flying, represented institutional knowledge that couldn't be replaced. The Americans lost the Yorktown. Within a year, they were commissioning new Essex-class carriers at a rate the Japanese couldn't match. The industrial capacity that would eventually drown the Japanese Empire in ships and aircraft was just beginning to spin up. Midway didn't end the Pacific War. That would take 3 more years and countless more battles. What Midway did was stop the Japanese advance and begin the long Allied push back across the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima to the Japanese home islands themselves. The lookout on the Akagi, who screamed Helldivers at 10:22 on June 4th, was watching the beginning of the end. He just didn't know it yet. 7 minutes later, so was everyone else. The wreck of the Akagi was located in 2019, resting 17,000 feet below the surface of the Pacific. Kaga was found the same year. The others remained down there somewhere, in the deep water northwest of Midway Atoll. Richard Best, the pilot whose single bomb turned the Akagi into a funeral pyre, survived the war. The oxygen system in his dive bomber had malfunctioned during the attack, exposing him to caustic fumes that damaged his lungs and ended his flying career. He died in 2001 at the age of 91. Wade McClusky, whose gamble to keep searching found the Japanese fleet, also survived. He retired as a Rear Admiral. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo 8, floated in the water for hours, watching the carriers burn before being rescued the next day. He spent the rest of his life as a living witness to the sacrifice his squadron made. 5 minutes of bombing, hours of burning, 4 carriers destroyed, and a war that would never be the same. That's what happened at Midway.